The radio crackled to life at 3:47 a.m., and dispatch told me they'd found the missing family, all four of them, sitting perfectly upright in their tent, eyes wide open, but they'd been dead for 3 days. I've been a ranger at Wolf Lake National Park for 8 years now, and in that time, I've seen things that have fundamentally changed how I view the wilderness. What I'm about to share with you are incidents that occurred between 2019 and 2024, all documented in official reports, though many details were deliberately omitted from the public record. My superiors have made it clear that certain information should remain classified, but recent events have convinced me that people need to know what's happening out here. Wolf Lake spans 847 square miles of pristine wilderness in the northern Rockies. We see approximately 180,000 visitors annually, and most leave with nothing more than mosquito bites and Instagram photos. But for a small percentage of visitors, their experience here becomes something entirely different, something that defies rational explanation. The first incident that really got my attention happened during my second year on the job. A family of 4, mother, father, and 2 young children, had been camping in the Whitewater Basin, about 27 miles from the nearest road access. They'd registered for a 5-day backcountry permit and were experienced hikers. The father, Gregory Vance, was a wilderness guide from Colorado with over 15 years of experience leading expeditions. On day 3 of their trip, Vance radioed in a distress call. His transmission was broken and difficult to understand, but what we could make out was disturbing. Something's wrong with the kids. They won't respond. Their eyes. Then the radio went dead. We couldn't raise them again despite repeated attempts. I was part of the SAR team that went in the next morning. It took us 4 hours to reach their campsite, and what we found there still haunts me. The tent was set up perfectly, all their gear organized and undisturbed. A cold breakfast sat on their camp table as if they'd been interrupted mid-meal. But the family was nowhere to be found. We spent 3 days searching a 10-mile radius around their camp. On the 3rd day, we found them. They were sitting in a small clearing about 2 miles northeast of their campsite, arranged in a perfect circle on the bare ground. All 4 were positioned facing inward, legs crossed, hands resting on their knees. Their eyes were open, staring at the center of the circle, but they were completely unresponsive. When we approached, none of them acknowledged our presence. They didn't blink, didn't react to our voices, didn't respond to physical contact. Their pulse and breathing were normal, but it was like they were in some kind of trance. The children, ages 8 and 10, maintained this same rigid posture and blank stare. The medical team had to physically carry them out. During the entire evacuation, none of them spoke or moved voluntarily. They were like mannequins. When we reached the hospital, the doctors ran every test imaginable: blood work, neurological exams, psychiatric evaluations. Everything came back normal. Physically, they were completely healthy. After 2 days in the hospital, they suddenly snapped out of it. One moment they were catatonic, the next they were asking where they were and how they'd gotten there. They claimed to have no memory of the 3 days they'd been missing. The last thing any of them remembered was going to sleep in their tent on the second night of their trip. The official report listed it as a case of mass hysteria brought on by altitude sickness and dehydration, despite the fact that they showed no signs of either condition. The family was released and returned home to Colorado. They never came back to Wolf Lake, and they never spoke publicly about what happened. That incident bothered me for months. I kept going back to that clearing, trying to find some explanation for what had occurred. The ground where they'd been sitting was completely bare. No grass, no vegetation, just packed earth in a perfect circle about 8 feet in diameter. I took soil samples and sent them to a lab for analysis. The results showed nothing unusual, just standard forest soil with slightly higher than normal mineral content. But there was something else about that clearing that unsettled me. The silence. In all my years working in the wilderness, I'd never experienced quiet like that. No bird calls, no insect sounds, no rustling of leaves. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath around that spot. Every time I visited, the unnatural quiet would last for exactly 17 minutes, then normal forest sounds would gradually return. I started keeping detailed notes after that incident, documenting every strange occurrence, every unusual disappearance, every unexplained phenomenon. What I discovered was that Wolf Lake had a problem, a pattern of incidents that stretched back decades, all carefully buried in bureaucratic paperwork and explained away with convenient lies. The brass doesn't want the public to know that people disappear in Wolf Lake at a rate 3 times higher than the national average for wilderness areas. They don't want anyone to know that we find bodies in places they couldn't possibly have reached on their own. They definitely don't want anyone to know about the recordings. Every ranger carries a digital recorder as part of their standard equipment, primarily for documenting wildlife observations and incident reports. But sometimes, when you play back those recordings, you hear things that weren't audible at the time, voices, whispers, sounds that seem to come from the forest itself. I have hours of these recordings. Conversations between missing persons that occurred days after their disappearance. Children's laughter echoing from areas where no children have been seen. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear what sounds like instructions being given in a language that doesn't match any human dialect I've ever encountered. The Park Service has a policy regarding these recordings. They're classified as equipment malfunctions and are not to be discussed with anyone outside the department. Rangers who persist in documenting these anomalies often find themselves transferred to other locations or encouraged to seek employment elsewhere. I've lasted 8 years by keeping my mouth shut and doing my job. But 3 weeks ago, something happened that changed everything. Something that made me realize that staying quiet isn't just wrong, it's dangerous. On the morning of October 15, 2024, I received a call that would fundamentally alter my understanding of what we're dealing with at Wolf Lake. The Jamison family, Robert, Susan, and their 16-year-old daughter Victoria, had failed to return from what should have been a simple 2-day hiking trip to Mirror Lake. Robert Jamison was a cardiac surgeon from Denver, methodical and cautious by nature. He'd been visiting Wolf Lake annually for 12 years and knew the trails better than some of our seasonal rangers. Mirror Lake was only 8 miles from the trailhead, a moderate hike that hundreds of families completed safely each year. The Jamisons were experienced, well-equipped, and had filed a detailed itinerary with our office. When they didn't return by 6 p.m. on their scheduled date, we initiated standard protocol. The first search team went out at dawn, led by my colleague Henderson, who'd been with the park for 15 years. They found the Jamisons' car still parked at the Mirror Lake trailhead, undisturbed. No signs of break-in, all their emergency supplies still in the trunk as planned. The trail to Mirror Lake is well maintained and clearly marked. There are only 2 places where hikers commonly get lost. A junction about 3 miles in where the main trail splits toward either Mirror Lake or Cascade Falls, and a rocky area near the lake where the path becomes less defined. Henderson's team checked both locations thoroughly. They found evidence of the Jamisons' passage, boot prints matching their registered shoe sizes, a candy wrapper that Susan Jamison had been carrying, even some disturbed vegetation where Victoria had apparently stepped off the trail to examine wildflowers, but the trail went cold about half a mile before Mirror Lake. The tracks simply vanished, as if the family had been lifted into the air. By the second day, we had 42 people involved in the search, including K-9 units and a helicopter. The dogs were able to follow the scent trail to the same spot where the tracks disappeared. Beyond that point, they showed no interest in any direction. They would approach the area where the trail ended, then sit down and refuse to go further, whining and showing signs of distress. The helicopter thermal imaging detected no heat signatures in the area. We expanded the search to a 15-mile radius, thinking perhaps they'd gotten disoriented and wandered off trail. Grid searches, aerial reconnaissance, even a specialized team rappelling down the cliff faces around Mirror Lake. Nothing. On the 3rd day, I was assigned to check some of the more remote areas that the other teams hadn't covered. I was working alone, which violated standard protocol, but we were stretched thin and desperate. I took the north trail that leads to an area we called Devil's Kitchen, a series of natural rock formations about 12 miles from where the Jamisons were last seen. Devil's Kitchen got its name from the way sound bounces off the rock walls. Even normal conversation creates strange echoes. and the wind passing through the formations produces sounds that can be mistaken for voices. It's not on any official trail map, and most visitors never find it. But experienced hikers sometimes seek it out for the unique acoustic properties. I reached the kitchen around 2 p.m. The area consists of several large sandstone formations arranged in a rough circle, creating a natural amphitheater about 50 yards across. The formations range from 15 to 30 feet high, with narrow passages between them that create the echo effects. As I entered the circle, I immediately noticed something was wrong. The usual wind sounds were absent, replaced by that same oppressive silence I'd experienced at the clearing where we found the Vance family. But this silence felt different, heavier, more deliberate, as if something was actively suppressing sound rather than it simply being absent. I activated my radio to report my location, but received only static. This wasn't unusual in the kitchen due to the surrounding rock formations, so I made a mental note to try again once I was clear of the area. I began a systematic search of the passages between the formations, looking for any sign that the Jamesons might have wandered into the area. It was in the third passage that I found Victoria's backpack. The backpack was wedged into a narrow crevice about 8 feet off the ground, as if it had been thrown or placed there deliberately. The straps were torn, and the contents were scattered across the rocky ground below. I documented everything with my camera before disturbing the scene, then carefully retrieved the pack and gathered the scattered items. Most of Victoria's belongings were there: water bottles, trail mix, a journal, spare socks, her digital camera. But her GPS device was missing, along with her emergency whistle and the bear spray her father had insisted she carry. More disturbing was the condition of the items I found. The water bottles had been drained and refilled with a viscous, dark liquid that smelled like rotting vegetation. The trail mix had been replaced with what appeared to be small bones and dried plant matter I couldn't identify. Victoria's journal provided some insight into their final day. The entries were written in her neat handwriting until the last few pages, where the writing became increasingly erratic. October 14th, 6:30 a.m. Dad woke us up early. Says we need to get moving to reach the lake before the afternoon heat. Mom packed extra water because the weather forecast showed temperatures in the 80s. I'm excited to see Mirror Lake again. Last time we were here, I saw a family of deer drinking at the water's edge. October 14th, 11:45 a.m. Stop for lunch at the rock outcropping Dad calls the bench. Great view of the valley from here. Mom spotted an eagle circling overhead. I took some photos with my camera. The trail is more overgrown than last year. Dad thinks the Park Service isn't maintaining it as well. October 14th, 2:15 p.m. Something's wrong. We've been hiking for 6 hours, but we haven't reached the lake yet. The trail looks different than I remember. The markers are gone. Dad is getting frustrated. Mom keeps checking her map, but it doesn't seem to match what we're seeing. The next entry was where things became disturbing. October 14th, we're lost. The sun is wrong. It's been setting for hours, but it never gets dark. Dad tried the GPS, but it just shows our location as a blank spot. We can hear water running somewhere ahead of us, so we're going to follow the sound. Maybe it's the lake. October 14th. Found the water. But it's not Mirror Lake. It's a stream that runs uphill. The water is flowing against gravity. Dad says that's impossible, but we can all see it. Mom is crying. I think we should turn back. The final entry was barely legible, the letters shaky and uneven. They want us to follow the water they keep calling from ahead, telling us to come down to the real lake, the one underneath the ground where the old ones sleep. After that, the pages were blank, except for what appeared to be crude drawings of twisted trees and figures that might have been human, but were wrong somehow. Too tall, limbs bent at impossible angles, faces that were just dark smudges with no features. I spent another hour searching Devil's Kitchen, but found no trace of Robert or Susan Jameson. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. In the soft sand at the center of the circle were footprints, lots of them, overlapping and confused, as if people had been walking in circles for hours. But these weren't hiking boot prints. They were bare feet, and they were huge, easily size 15 or larger. Mixed in with the large prints were smaller ones that could have belonged to the Jamesons. But these smaller prints showed signs of being dragged rather than walked. Long scrape marks in the sand, as if the people had been pulled while trying to resist. I followed the drag marks to the largest of the rock formations. At its base was an opening I hadn't noticed before, a crack in the rock just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The opening descended at a steep angle, disappearing into absolute darkness. The drag marks led directly to this opening and vanished inside. I called out, hoping to hear some response from the depths, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. I dropped a small rock into the opening and counted, waiting to hear it hit bottom. I never heard it land. Standard protocol dictated that I should mark the location and call for backup before exploring any cave systems. But something about the drag marks, the way they suggested urgency and struggle, made me feel like time was critical. I squeezed through the opening and began my descent into the rock formation. The passage was narrow and steep, requiring me to crawl in some sections. My flashlight beam revealed smooth walls that seemed almost melted, as if the rock had been heated to the point of flowing. After about 30 feet, the passage opened into a larger chamber. What I found there violated every law of physics and geology I'd ever learned. The chamber was impossibly vast, easily the size of an airplane hangar, carved from solid rock. But Wolf Lake's sandstone formations aren't large enough to contain such a space. The chamber should have extended far beyond the boundaries of the rock formation above. Scattered across the chamber floor were dozens of personal items: backpacks, clothing, camping gear, jewelry. All of it appeared to have been there for years, covered in a thin layer of dust and what looked like spider webs. But the items represented decades of different styles and brands. I found a Girl Scout badge from a troop that had been disbanded in 1987. A digital camera that hadn't been manufactured until 2018. A park permit stamped with a date from 1983. But the Jamesons weren't there. The chamber was empty of human remains, despite the clear evidence that many people had passed through this space. I spent 20 minutes documenting everything with my camera and collecting a few smaller items as evidence, then began my climb back to the surface. When I emerged from the opening, I was disoriented to find that the sun was setting. According to my watch, I'd been underground for less than an hour, but the light suggested it was near dusk. I'd entered the chamber in mid-afternoon. The drive back to headquarters took 2 hours, during which my radio remained dead. I tried my cell phone but found no signal, which was unusual for that area. It wasn't until I was within 5 miles of the ranger station that my equipment began functioning normally again. My report of the discovery was met with skepticism and concern. My supervisor, Chief Ranger Douglas, questioned why I had violated protocol by entering the cave system alone. When I mentioned the chamber's impossible size and the collection of artifacts, he suggested that I might have become disoriented underground and misjudged the dimensions. The next morning, Douglas led a team back to Devil's Kitchen to investigate my claims. I guided them to the exact location where I'd found the opening in the rock formation. But when we arrived, there was no opening. The rock face was solid, unbroken stone. We spent 3 hours examining every inch of the formation, but found no cracks, no crevices, nothing that could accommodate human passage. Douglas was diplomatic but firm. The stress of the search had affected my judgment, and I should take a few days off to rest. The official report stated that Victoria Jameson's backpack had been found at Devil's Kitchen, but made no mention of an underground chamber or the artifacts I'd documented. The Jameson family was never found. After 2 weeks, the case was classified as a wilderness disappearance, with the official conclusion that they had become lost and died of exposure in an area too remote to recover their remains. Their disappearance received minimal media coverage, described as a tragic reminder of the dangers of backcountry hiking. But I kept the photographs I'd taken in the chamber, along with the small items I'd collected as evidence. The photos showed exactly what I remembered: the vast underground space, the scattered belongings, the clear evidence of decades of human passage. The items I'd taken included Victoria's emergency whistle and a park permit from 1991. 3 days after the official search was called off, I received an anonymous package at my home address. Inside was a handwritten note: "Stop looking. Stop asking questions. Stop remembering. This is your only warning. The note was unsigned, but the paper was official Park Service stationery. That night, someone broke into my house. Nothing was stolen, but my computer hard drive had been wiped clean. The physical evidence I'd collected from the chamber was gone, along with the photographs I'd printed. Only the digital copies hidden on a backup drive at my office remained. I realized then that whatever was happening at Wolf Lake wasn't just a natural phenomenon. There were people involved. People within the Park Service who were actively covering up these incidents. People who were willing to break into a ranger's home to destroy evidence. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've been more careful about my documentation, more selective about who I trust. But I've also been more determined to understand what's really happening here. Because the Jameson incident wasn't an isolated occurrence. It was part of a pattern that stretches back decades, involving hundreds of missing persons and a systematic cover-up by the very people tasked with protecting public safety. After the Jameson incident, I began to pay closer attention to the strange audio recordings that our equipment captured during routine patrols. What I discovered was that these recordings weren't random equipment malfunctions, as the Park Service claimed. They were consistent, patterned, and somehow connected to the disappearances. Every ranger carries a digital voice recorder as standard equipment. We're supposed to use them for documenting wildlife observations, noting trail conditions, and recording incident reports. The recordings are uploaded to the park database each week as part of our regular reporting protocol. Most rangers record hours of mundane observations, weather conditions, animal sightings, maintenance needs. But sometimes, when you play back these recordings, you hear things that weren't audible during the actual patrol. Voices, sounds, conversations that none of us remember hearing in the field. The official explanation is that the recording equipment occasionally picks up radio transmissions from other agencies, or that atmospheric conditions can cause sound to carry from distant sources. I started keeping copies of my recordings before uploading them to the park database. What I found was that the database versions were often different from the originals. Sections would be missing, or the audio quality would be degraded to the point where the anomalous sounds were no longer audible. Someone was editing the recordings before they were archived. The first recording that really caught my attention was from a routine patrol I'd conducted in September, 2 weeks before the Jameson family disappeared. I was documenting a beaver dam that had caused flooding on the North Point Trail, about 15 miles from any visitor areas. The recording should have contained only my voice describing the dam's construction and its impact on the trail drainage. But when I played back the original recording, there was something else. About 3 minutes into my documentation of the beaver dam, a child's voice could be heard in the background, singing what sounded like a nursery rhyme. The voice was clear and distinct, but I have no memory of hearing it during the patrol. The area where I was working was miles from any camping areas, and I hadn't encountered any families with children that day. The child was singing, "Round and round the mulberry bush, the monkey chased the weasel. The monkey thought, 'twas all in fun, pop goes the weasel." But the melody was wrong, slower, more mournful, like a funeral dirge. And the voice had an odd quality to it, as if it were coming from very far away or from underwater. I isolated the audio and played it for Henderson, who had been with the park for 15 years. He went pale when he heard it and told me that he'd been hearing similar voices on his recordings for years. But when he'd brought it to the attention of previous supervisors, he'd been told to stop discussing it or face disciplinary action. Henderson agreed to share some of his archived recordings with me, and what I heard was disturbing. Hours of audio containing voices that shouldn't have been there. Children calling for help in areas where no children were missing. Adults having conversations about events that hadn't occurred yet, and sometimes what sounded like radio transmissions in languages that didn't match any human dialect. One recording from 2019 contained a clear conversation between 2 adult males discussing a family that would go missing 3 weeks later. The voices described the family's planned route, their camping equipment, even specific details about their vehicle that wouldn't be available to the public. But the conversation was recorded in an area where Henderson had been working alone, documenting fire damage from the previous summer. Another recording from 2021 contained what sounded like a distress call from a missing hiker named Kevin Brock. Brock had disappeared during a solo backpacking trip, and despite extensive searches, his body was never found. But the recording captured his voice, clearly identifying himself and describing his location, a location that searchers had checked multiple times without finding any trace of him. The most disturbing recording was from my own equipment, captured during a patrol last month. I was checking backcountry campsites in the Willowbrook area, a routine inspection that should have taken about 4 hours. The recording captured normal sounds for the first 2 hours. My voice noting campsite conditions, occasional bird calls, the sound of my boots on the trail. But then something changed. About 2.5 hours into the recording, my voice began describing things I don't remember seeing. I was apparently documenting a campsite that contained a family of 4, describing their tent setup, their camping equipment, even commenting on how well organized their site was. But I have no memory of encountering any campers that day, and my written report shows that all the backcountry sites I checked were empty. The recording continued for another hour, with my voice having what sounded like a conversation with these invisible campers. I was giving them advice about bear safety, recommending hiking trails, discussing weather conditions. At one point, I apparently helped them identify a bird they'd seen, explaining the feeding habits of mountain bluebirds in detail. But the most chilling part was the end of the recording. My voice gradually became more distorted, as if I were moving away from the microphone or speaking through some sort of barrier. The last clear words I spoke were, "Yes, I understand. I'll make sure no one finds them. The arrangement will be honored." I have no memory of speaking those words. I don't remember any conversation with campers, any discussion about arrangements, any promise to keep something hidden. But it's definitely my voice on the recording, speaking with my normal inflection and vocabulary. When I checked the park database the next week, the uploaded version of my recording had been edited. The sections containing the conversation with the invisible campers had been removed, leaving only my routine documentation of empty campsites. The official record showed a normal patrol with no unusual incidents. I began to wonder if these recordings were capturing something more than just audio anomalies. What if they were documenting events that existed in some parallel version of reality? What if the missing persons cases weren't just people getting lost in the wilderness, but people slipping between different versions of Wolf Lake? The theory sounds insane, but it's the only explanation that accounts for all the evidence. The bodies found in impossible locations, the families discovered in catatonic states with no memory of their experience, the chambers that exist underground but can't be found again, the recordings that capture events that didn't happen in our version of reality. 3 weeks ago, I made a decision that violated every protocol and probably ended my career. I began deliberately seeking out the locations where these audio anomalies were most common, carrying multiple recording devices and trying to document what was really happening during these incidents. What I discovered was that certain areas of Wolf Lake exist in a state of dimensional instability, places where the barriers between different versions of reality are thin enough for people to slip through accidentally. And there are entities in these alternate versions that have learned to exploit these weak points, drawing people in for purposes I'm only beginning to understand. The Park Service knows about this. They've known for decades. The cover-ups, the edited recordings, the systematic suppression of evidence, it's all part of a larger effort to keep the public from learning that Wolf Lake is fundamentally unsafe in ways that can't be explained by conventional science. But the cover-up has allowed the problem to get worse. Each year, more people disappear. Each year, the dimensional barriers become more unstable. And each year, the entities on the other side become more aggressive in their efforts to draw people through. I've documented 17 separate incidents in the past month alone. 17 times when recording equipment captured events that didn't occur in our reality. And based on the pattern I'm seeing, I believe we're approaching some kind of critical point, a time when the barriers between realities might collapse entirely. What I found in my most recent recording suggests that this critical point might be only days away. The breakthrough came when I realized that the scattered incidents across Wolf Lake weren't random. They followed a pattern, occurring at specific locations that formed a geometric network across the park's 847 square miles. When I plotted all the disappearances, strange discoveries, and audio anomalies on a topographical map, I found that they aligned with underground geological features that weren't in any of the park's official documentation. It started with Dr. Margaret Simmons, a geology professor from the University of Colorado, who had been studying Wolf Lake's mineral formations for her research on volcanic activity in the region. Dr. Simmons had obtained permits to conduct ground-penetrating radar surveys in several areas of the park, looking for underground magma chambers that might indicate future volcanic activity. What she found instead was a network of hollow spaces beneath Wolf Lake that defied geological explanation. Chambers, tunnels, and caverns that extended far beyond what the surface rock formations could contain. Some of these underground spaces were enormous, larger than sports stadiums, existing at depths that should have been solid bedrock. Dr. Simmons brought her findings to the Park Service in early 2023, excited about the potential for discovering new cave systems that could be developed for public tours. She was told that her research was mistaken, that her equipment had malfunctioned, and that she was not authorized to conduct further surveys. Her permits were revoked, and she was banned from the park. But before she left, Dr. Simmons shared her findings with me. She had been troubled by the Park Service's reaction to her discovery and wanted someone within the organization to have access to her data. The underground network she had mapped corresponded exactly with the locations where people had disappeared over the past 20 years. Every single disappearance in Wolf Lake had occurred within a quarter mile of one of these underground chambers. Every location where we'd found bodies in impossible positions was directly above a mapped cavern. Every site where audio equipment had captured anomalous recordings was connected to the subterranean network. Dr. Simmons had also discovered something else. The underground chambers weren't natural. The radar signatures showed perfectly geometric shapes, smooth walls, and structural features that indicated deliberate construction. Someone or something had excavated these spaces, creating an artificial network beneath Wolf Lake that connected almost every area of the park. Armed with this information, I began to understand what I'd experienced in Devil's Kitchen. The chamber I'd found beneath the rock formation was part of this larger network. The reason the opening had vanished when the official search team returned was that it had been deliberately sealed from the inside. I decided to use Dr. Simmons's data to access the network through a different entrance. Her radar surveys had identified 17 possible access points, most of them in remote areas that were rarely visited by the public. I chose a location in the Greystone Valley, about 35 miles from park headquarters, where the underground chamber was relatively close to the surface. The valley was accessible only by an old mining road that had been abandoned since the 1960s. According to park records, it was scheduled for regular patrols only twice each year. The underground chamber beneath the valley was one of the largest Dr. Simmons had detected, roughly the size of a football field, and positioned only 20 feet below the surface. I told my supervisor that I was taking a personal day to visit my sister in Denver, then drove to Greystone Valley with enough equipment to spend 24 hours underground if necessary. I brought multiple light sources, emergency food and water, communication equipment, and every recording device I could carry. The entrance to the underground chamber was hidden beneath a rockfall that appeared natural but showed signs of deliberate arrangement. Moving the smaller rocks revealed a narrow passage that descended at a steep angle, similar to what I'd found at Devil's Kitchen, but larger and more accessible. The passage opened into the chamber Dr. Simmons had detected, but her radar survey hadn't revealed the most disturbing aspect of the space. The chamber wasn't empty. It was filled with structures that defied easy description. Geometric forms that seemed to shift and change when observed directly, surfaces that reflected light in ways that suggested they were made of materials not found on Earth. The structures were arranged in precise patterns, creating corridors and spaces that led deeper into the underground network. Some of the surfaces contained what appeared to be writing or symbols, but the characters were unlike any human alphabet. They seemed to move when observed, rearranging themselves in different patterns that might have conveyed different meanings. But the most disturbing discovery was the evidence of human habitation. Throughout the chamber were personal items that clearly belonged to people who had disappeared from Wolf Lake over the years. But these weren't scattered randomly like the artifacts I'd found at Devil's Kitchen. They were arranged carefully, almost respectfully, as if someone had been collecting and preserving them. I found Robert Jameson's wallet in a small alcove, positioned next to items that belonged to the Vance family. Victoria Jameson's GPS device was mounted on what appeared to be a wall display, alongside dozens of other electronic devices that belonged to missing persons. The display seemed to be organized chronologically, with older items like analog watches and film cameras positioned on the left, progressing to modern smartphones and digital cameras on the right. The implications were horrifying. Someone or something had been systematically collecting trophies from the people who disappeared in Wolf Lake. The collection represented decades of missing persons cases, hundreds of individuals who had vanished without explanation. As I moved deeper into the chamber, I began to understand the true scope of the underground network. Passages led off in multiple directions, some descending to lower levels, others ascending toward different surface access points. The entire network was illuminated by a soft, pale light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, providing just enough visibility to navigate safely. Following one of the main corridors, I discovered that the network extended far beyond Wolf Lake's official boundaries. The passages connected to chambers beneath neighboring wilderness areas, creating a subterranean highway system that could allow someone to travel hundreds of miles underground without ever appearing on the surface. It was in one of these deeper chambers that I found evidence of the current inhabitants of the network. The space was clearly being used as living quarters, furnished with items that had been taken from the surface world but arranged in ways that suggested non-human occupants. Sleeping areas that were too small for adult humans but too large for children. Furniture that was positioned at angles that would be uncomfortable for people with normal joint mobility. Most disturbing were the food storage areas, caches of preserved meat that included recognizable human teeth and bone fragments. Water containers filled with liquid that smelled like the dark substance I'd found in Victoria Jameson's water bottles. And everywhere, the strange symbols that seemed to move and change when observed directly. I was documenting these discoveries with my camera when I heard sounds from the corridor I'd used to enter the chamber. Footsteps, but with an odd rhythm. Too many steps per stride, as if the walker had more than 2 legs. And voices, speaking in the same language I'd heard on the anomalous recordings, but clearer and more distinct than any previous audio capture. I shut off my flashlight and tried to hide among the strange furniture, but the voices were getting closer. They seemed to be having a conversation about something they called the harvest, discussing numbers and dates that corresponded to upcoming park events. They mentioned specific families who had camping reservations, describing their equipment and planned routes with accuracy that suggested extensive surveillance. The footsteps entered the chamber where I was hiding, and I could see shapes moving in the pale light that emanated from the walls. The shapes were roughly human in size, but wrong in proportions, too tall, with limbs that bent in directions that human joints don't allow. They moved with a fluid grace that was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. One of the shapes approached my hiding spot, and I was certain I would be discovered. But instead of investigating, it began rearranging some of the trophy displays, adding items I hadn't seen before. A child's backpack that looked like it belonged to someone who had disappeared very recently. A park ranger's radio that I recognized as the model currently issued to staff. The voices continued their discussion, and I began to understand that these entities were responsible for the disappearances in Wolf Lake. They were systematically harvesting humans from the surface, bringing them down to the underground network for purposes that I couldn't fully comprehend from their alien language. But I also understood that they weren't working alone. References to the arrangement and surface collaborators made it clear that there were people within the Park Service who were facilitating these activities. People who edited the recordings, suppressed evidence, and ensured that the investigations never revealed the truth. I spent 4 hours hidden in that chamber, documenting everything I could see and hear. The entities eventually left, but their conversation had provided enough information to understand that something significant was planned for the upcoming weekend. Wolf Lake was expecting its largest group of visitors since the summer season, Over 3,000 people registered for camping and hiking permits for the Columbus Day weekend. The entities referred to this as the Grand Harvest, discussing it with an excitement that suggested this was an event they had been planning for years. They mentioned specific locations where they would be collecting, all of them corresponding to popular camping areas and trailheads. When I finally emerged from the underground network, it was nearly dawn. The drive back to park headquarters took 2 hours, during which I tried to process what I had learned and decide how to respond. The evidence I had gathered was overwhelming, but I knew that reporting it through official channels would result in the same cover-up that had buried previous discoveries. Instead, I decided to take action on my own. I began warning people directly, approaching campers and hikers to tell them about the dangers they faced. Most of them thought I was either joking or having a mental breakdown. Some reported my behavior to park management, resulting in an official reprimand and a mandatory psychological evaluation. The psychological evaluation was conducted by Dr. Patricia Kemp, a psychiatrist who had been working with the Park Service for over a decade. During our session, she asked detailed questions about my experiences, my recordings, and my theories about what was happening at Wolf Lake. She seemed genuinely interested in my answers, taking extensive notes and asking for clarification on specific points. At the end of the session, Dr. Kemp told me that my experiences were consistent with a stress-related condition that was common among rangers who worked in remote areas for extended periods. She prescribed medication and recommended 2 weeks of leave to rest and recover. She also asked me to avoid discussing my theories with other staff members or park visitors, as this could damage public confidence in park safety. But as I was leaving her office, Dr. Kemp made a comment that froze my blood. The arrangement has been working well for many years. It would be unfortunate if someone's individual concerns disrupted a system that serves the greater good. She knew Dr. Kemp was one of the surface collaborators using her position to identify and neutralize rangers who discovered the truth. The psychological evaluation wasn't meant to help me. It was meant to assess whether I could be controlled or needed to be eliminated. That night, I made copies of all my evidence and hid them in multiple locations. I also wrote detailed accounts of everything I had discovered, leaving copies with trusted friends outside the Park Service. If something happened to me, the truth would still be available to people who might be able to take action. 3 days later, I received a transfer order. I was being reassigned to a desk job at park headquarters, effective immediately. My patrol duties were suspended pending the results of my psychological evaluation. I would no longer have access to the remote areas of Wolf Lake where I had made my discoveries. But the transfer order came too late. I had already made plans for Columbus Day weekend. Plans that would either expose the truth about Wolf Lake or get me killed in the attempt. Columbus Day weekend 2024 was supposed to be my last chance to document the truth about Wolf Lake before being transferred to a desk job. What actually happened was worse than anything I could have imagined. A systematic harvesting of human beings conducted with the full knowledge and cooperation of Park Service management. I had spent the previous week studying the patterns in the underground network, cross-referencing Dr. Simmons's geological data with historical disappearance records and the entity's overheard conversations. The locations they had mentioned as collection points during the Grand Harvest were all popular camping areas that would be packed with families during the holiday weekend. Firebird Campground was their primary target. Located in a scenic valley beside Wolf Lake itself, Firebird was the park's largest developed camping area, with 127 sites that were fully booked for the 3-day weekend. The campground was positioned directly above one of the largest underground chambers in the network, with multiple access points that could be used to move people without being seen. On Friday evening, I positioned myself on the ridge overlooking Firebird Campground with a full set of surveillance equipment. My official assignment was to conduct a desk audit of camping permits, but I had called in sick and was working independently. If I was caught, it would probably end my career. But the alternative was allowing hundreds of people to disappear without anyone knowing what had happened to them. The campground filled up quickly as families arrived for the long weekend. By sunset, nearly every site was occupied, with RVs, tents, and camping equipment scattered across the valley floor. Children played in the open areas while their parents set up campsites. and the normal sounds of families enjoying the outdoors echoed off the surrounding hills. Everything appeared completely normal until approximately 10:30 p.m., when the first signs of the harvest began. It started with the lights. The campground was equipped with standard electrical service, providing power to the RV sites and scattered light posts throughout the area. But at 10:30, all the electrical systems began to malfunction. Not a complete power failure, but an irregular dimming and brightening that created a strobe-like effect across the entire campground. The campers initially treated it as a minor inconvenience, joking about government electrical systems and making plans to use flashlights and lanterns. But the light fluctuations were having a more subtle effect. Through my binoculars, I could see that people were becoming disoriented, moving more slowly, their interactions becoming less animated. Within 30 minutes, the campground had become eerily quiet. Families that had been laughing and talking around campfires were now sitting in silence, staring at the flickering lights with blank expressions. Children stopped playing and stood motionless beside their parents, all of them gazing upward at the malfunctioning light posts. At 11:15, the access points opened. I had expected the entities to emerge from the underground network through hidden entrances in the forest, but what actually happened was far more sophisticated. The ground itself began to open in several locations throughout the campground, revealing perfectly circular holes that descended into the underground chambers. But these weren't rough cave openings. They were smooth, precisely engineered access points that appeared to be operated by some kind of mechanical system. As they opened, soft light emanated from the depths, and the strange symbols I had seen on the underground walls appeared around the rim of each opening, glowing with the same pale illumination. The campers showed no surprise or alarm at these developments. Instead, they began to move toward the openings with the same blank expressions they had worn while staring at the lights. Families walked hand in hand to the edge of the holes and began to descend, disappearing into the underground network without any sign of resistance or fear. I was documenting everything with my camera when I realized that something was wrong with the family's behavior. They weren't moving like people who had been hypnotized or drugged. They were moving like people who had been expecting this to happen, as if they had been given instructions they were now following. Through my telephoto lens, I could see that some of the adults were carrying equipment that hadn't been part of their original camping gear. Emergency supplies, additional clothing, and other items that suggested they had been preparing for an extended journey underground. They weren't being kidnapped. They were following a predetermined plan. At 11:45, I saw something that explained everything I had witnessed over the past 8 years. A group of people in Park Service uniforms emerged from the forest and began moving through the campground, helping to organize the families and direct them toward the access points. They were working with the entities, facilitating the harvest with the efficiency of a well-practiced routine. One of the uniformed figures was Dr. Patricia Kemp, the psychiatrist who had conducted my evaluation. Another was Henderson, the veteran ranger who had shared his recordings with me. And leading the group was Chief Ranger Douglas, directing the operation with the calm authority of someone who had done this many times before. They weren't reluctant participants or unwilling collaborators. They were active partners in the systematic abduction of park visitors, working with non-human entities to harvest people for purposes that I still couldn't fully understand. I was so focused on documenting the activities in the campground that I almost missed the approach of the extraction team. 3 figures in ranger uniforms were climbing the ridge toward my position, moving with the inhuman grace I had observed in the underground chambers. They had detected my surveillance and were coming to collect me. I packed my equipment quickly and began to retreat toward my vehicle, but the extraction team was faster than normal humans. They reached my position within minutes, and I found myself surrounded by entities wearing the faces of people I recognized. Park rangers who had disappeared over the years, their appearances somehow preserved and worn by the creatures from the underground network. The entity wearing Ranger Morrison's face spoke in Morrison's voice. "You have seen enough. You will come with us now. The arrangement requires your cooperation." Morrison had vanished during a routine patrol in 2019, and his body had never been found. Now I understood why. I tried to run, but the extraction team moved with coordinated precision, cutting off every escape route. They didn't use force or violence. They simply positioned themselves in ways that made it impossible for me to avoid capture. It was like being herded by predators who understood human psychology well enough to manipulate my movements without direct confrontation. They escorted me down the ridge toward the campground, where the harvest was nearing completion. Most of the camping families had already descended into the underground network, leaving behind empty campsites with all their equipment still in place. The scene looked like a mass evacuation, but there were no signs of panic or struggle. As we approached the largest access point, I could see into the depths of the underground chamber. The families were being organized into groups and led through different passages, presumably to different destinations within the network. The process was systematic and orderly, conducted with the efficiency of an organization that had been perfecting this procedure for decades. Dr. Kemp approached our group as we reached the access point. She looked at me with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry it had to be this way. We tried to give you opportunities to walk away, to accept a transfer and leave the questions unasked. But you were too persistent, too committed to finding the truth." She gestured toward the underground chamber. "What you've discovered isn't evil, it's necessary. The entities you've encountered aren't invaders or parasites. They're partners in a mutually beneficial arrangement that has been in place for over 50 years. They provide us with resources and knowledge that have advanced human civilization in ways the public could never understand. In exchange, we provide them with what they need to survive." I asked what they needed the people for. What happened to the families who disappeared into the underground network? Dr. Kemp's expression became more serious. "Some questions are better left unanswered. What matters is that the arrangement serves the greater good. The resources we receive are used to fund research, to advance technology, to solve problems that affect millions of people. The sacrifice of a few hundred individuals each year is a reasonable price to pay for benefits that improve life for everyone else." The rationalization was chilling in its calm logic. These weren't deranged individuals acting on psychotic impulses. They were rational people who had made a calculated decision to trade human lives for abstract benefits. They had convinced themselves that the arrangement was morally justified because it served a larger purpose. As they prepared to escort me into the underground chamber, I made a desperate attempt to create a distraction. I activated the emergency beacon on my radio, broadcasting a distress signal that would be picked up by every ranger station in the region. I also triggered my camera's automatic upload function, sending the last batch of photos directly to a cloud storage account that wasn't monitored by the Park Service. The distraction worked long enough for me to break away from the extraction team and run toward the forest. But instead of pursuing me, they simply waited. Within minutes, I was surrounded again, this time by a larger group that included Chief Ranger Douglas and several other park officials. Douglas spoke with the weary tone of someone explaining something to a particularly slow child. "The distress signal has been received and canceled. The photos you uploaded have been intercepted and deleted. Every communication you've made tonight has been monitored and controlled. Did you really think you were the first ranger to discover the truth? Did you think we hadn't planned for this situation?" He was right. Every step I had taken, every discovery I had made, had been anticipated and managed. The entities and their human collaborators had been operating for decades, and they had extensive experience in dealing with individuals who stumbled onto their activities. But as they escorted me toward the access point, something unexpected happened. The emergency beacon I had activated was picked up by a search and rescue team from the neighboring state forest, a group that wasn't part of the Wolf Lake conspiracy. They arrived just as the harvest was completing, flying low over the campground in a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging and spotlights. The pilot reported what he saw to the State Emergency Management Office, an evacuation in progress at Firebird Campground, with multiple people being led into what appeared to be cave openings in the ground. The report triggered a multi-agency response that included state police, federal emergency management, and media outlets. Within 2 hours, Wolf Lake was swarming with investigators, reporters, and rescue teams. The Park Service tried to explain the situation as a planned evacuation due to a gas leak, but the story didn't hold up under scrutiny. There was no evidence of gas leaks, no explanation for the circular openings in the ground, and no account of where the evacuated families had been taken. The investigation revealed that 347 people had been registered for camping permits at Firebird Campground that weekend, but only 23 individuals could be located. The remaining 324 people had vanished without explanation, leaving behind all their personal belongings and vehicles. It was the largest mass disappearance in U.S. history. The story became national news within hours, generating intense media coverage and public demands for answers. The Park Service's attempted cover-up collapsed under the pressure of external investigation, and several officials, including Chief Ranger Douglas and Dr. Patricia Kemp, were arrested on charges of conspiracy and endangering public safety. But the arrested officials never revealed the truth about the underground network or their arrangement with the entities. They insisted that the disappearances were the result of a natural disaster that had caused a sinkhole to open beneath the campground, swallowing the missing families. They claimed that the investigation would eventually find the bodies in underground caves, but that the search was complicated by unstable geological conditions. The access points had been sealed by the time the external investigators arrived, filled with concrete and disguised to look like natural geological features. The underground chambers detected by Dr. Simmons's radar surveys were explained as natural cave systems that posed no threat to public safety. The extensive network she had mapped was dismissed as a misinterpretation of normal geological formations. I was one of the few witnesses to what had actually happened, and my testimony was crucial to the investigation. But I was also a Park Service employee whose mental health had been questioned by the organization's official psychiatrist. My credibility was compromised by the very system I was trying to expose. The federal investigation eventually concluded that the Columbus Day incident was the result of gross negligence and cover-up by Park Service officials, but found no evidence of the systematic conspiracy I described. The missing families were declared victims of a natural disaster, and their cases were closed without resolution. Wolf Lake National Park was shut down indefinitely while the investigation continued, and all personnel were reassigned to other locations. The park's closure was described as a temporary safety measure, while geological surveys were conducted to ensure that similar incidents wouldn't occur in the future. But I knew that the closure was really an opportunity for the entities and their human collaborators to relocate their operations to other wilderness areas. The arrangement hadn't been ended. It had simply been moved to locations where it would be harder to detect and expose. 2 years have passed since the Columbus Day incident, and I'm still trying to understand what I witnessed that night. The official investigation is closed, the media has moved on to other stories, and the families who disappeared have been largely forgotten by everyone except their relatives. But the underground network is still there, extending beneath Wolf Lake and connecting to similar systems in wilderness areas across the country. The entities are still harvesting humans, and there are still people within government agencies who are facilitating their activities in exchange for benefits that the public will never know about. The arrangement continues, and more people disappear every year. After Wolf Lake was closed, I was transferred to Glacier National Park in Montana, officially to help with their visitor safety program. In reality, it was exile, a way to isolate me from the ongoing investigation while keeping me within the system where my activities could be monitored. But the transfer also gave me access to records and resources that revealed the true scope of what I had discovered. The arrangement wasn't limited to Wolf Lake. It existed in wilderness areas across the United States, managed by a network of federal employees who had been facilitating these activities for decades. The entities I had encountered were part of a larger population that had established underground colonies beneath multiple national parks and forests. My new supervisor at Glacier was Deputy Chief Ranger Agnes Thornfield, a woman who had worked in the Park Service for over 30 years. During my first week, she made it clear that she was aware of my history and the circumstances of my transfer. She also made it clear that she expected me to focus on my assigned duties and avoid the kind of disruptive investigations that had caused problems at Wolf Lake. But Thornfield was different from the collaborators I had encountered at Wolf Lake. She wasn't actively facilitating the entity's activities. She was simply someone who had learned to look the other way when strange things happened. Her attitude was one of resigned acceptance, rather than active participation. During a private conversation in her office, she explained how the system worked. Every park has incidents that can't be explained by conventional methods: missing persons who vanish without trace, bodies found in impossible locations, equipment that malfunctions in ways that don't make sense. Most rangers learn to document these incidents according to official protocols and avoid asking too many questions. She leaned back in her chair, looking tired. The ones who persist in investigating these incidents either get transferred to desk jobs like you, or they disappear entirely. There's a whole network of people whose job it is to manage rangers who discover too much. Some get reassigned, some get discredited, some get eliminated. Thornfield opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. These are the records of rangers who have been removed from service over the past 20 years. 43 people who asked too many questions or discovered too much evidence. Officially, they resigned, transferred to other agencies, or died in accidents. Unofficially, they were neutralized by the same system you encountered at Wolf Lake. The folder contained personnel files for rangers who had worked at parks across the country. All of them had documented incidents similar to what I had experienced. Strange recordings, impossible discoveries, evidence that pointed to systematic cover-ups. And all of them had eventually been removed from their positions through various means. Some had been transferred multiple times until they finally gave up and resigned. Others had been subjected to psychological evaluations that concluded they were unfit for duty. A few had died in accidents that seemed suspicious, but couldn't be proven to be anything more than bad luck. The system has been in place since the 1970s, Thornfield continued. It started as a way to manage public relations around unexplained incidents in national parks. But over time, it evolved into something more sophisticated. The people who run it realized that they could use these incidents to their advantage, trading cooperation for resources that benefit their other projects. She showed me documents that revealed the financial structure behind the arrangement. Entities from the underground networks provided rare minerals, advanced materials, and other resources that were used to fund black-budget research projects. In exchange, the Park Service provided access to wilderness areas and helped facilitate the entity's harvesting activities. The resources they provide are worth billions of dollars, Thornfield explained. Materials that don't exist anywhere else on Earth, substances that have properties our scientists don't understand. These materials are used in military research, medical development, technological advancement. The public benefits from these discoveries without ever knowing where they came from. The rationalization was similar to what Dr. Kemp had told me at Wolf Lake, but Thornfield seemed less convinced of its moral justification. She continued to participate in the system, but more out of self-preservation than ideological commitment. "I'm telling you this because you need to understand the reality of your situation," she said. "You've seen too much to ever be trusted with normal duties again. Your choice is to accept a desk job and keep quiet about what you know, or to continue investigating and face the consequences." But she also gave me something that the Wolf Lake conspirators hadn't: information about other rangers who were quietly working to expose the system. People who had discovered pieces of the truth and were documenting evidence while avoiding the attention of the management network. "There are others like you," she said quietly. "Rangers who know that something is wrong but haven't been neutralized yet. If you're careful, if you're smart about how you communicate, you might be able to work with them. But if you get caught, I can't protect you." Over the following months, I made contact with 17 other rangers across the country who were investigating similar phenomena. We communicated through encrypted channels and met in person only when absolutely necessary. What we discovered was that the underground network extended far beyond what any of us had imagined. The entities had established colonies beneath at least 37 national parks and forests, connected by tunnels that spanned thousands of miles. The network included manufacturing facilities where they processed the resources they extracted from Earth, research stations where they studied human behavior and biology, and storage areas where they kept the people they harvested from the surface world. But the most disturbing discovery was that the harvesting wasn't random. The entities were conducting systematic experiments on human subjects, studying everything from genetics to psychology to social behavior. The people who disappeared from national parks weren't being killed. They were being kept alive for research purposes. We found evidence that some of the missing persons had been underground for years, used as test subjects in experiments that ranged from medical research to psychological manipulation. The entities were learning how to control human behavior, how to modify human genetics, how to create hybrid offspring that combined human and non-human characteristics. The research was being conducted with the full knowledge and cooperation of certain government agencies who received the results of these experiments in exchange for continued access to wilderness areas. The medical breakthroughs, technological advances, and scientific discoveries that emerged from this research were integrated into legitimate programs and presented to the public as the result of conventional investigation. One of the rangers in our network, a man named David Torres who worked at Yosemite, had discovered a document that outlined the ultimate goal of the arrangement. The entities weren't just studying humans, they were preparing to replace them. The harvesting, the experiments, the research were all part of a long-term project to develop hybrid beings that could function in both the surface world and the underground network. They're planning to phase out pure humans over the next century, Torres explained during one of our encrypted communications. The hybrids will be stronger, more intelligent, more adaptable to the environmental changes that are coming. They'll inherit the Earth while the original human population is gradually eliminated. The document Torres had found suggested that the entities had been working toward this goal for over 200 years, establishing their underground colonies and studying human civilization in preparation for the eventual takeover. The arrangement with government agencies was just the most recent phase of a plan that had been in development since the 1800s. But our investigation also revealed weaknesses in the system. The entities depended on human collaborators to access surface resources and manage public relations around their activities. If enough people learned the truth, if the collaboration could be exposed and ended, the entities would lose their ability to operate openly. We began planning a coordinated release of information that would make it impossible for the government to continue the cover-up. Documents, photographs, recordings, testimony from multiple sources across the country, everything we had gathered would be released simultaneously to media outlets, law enforcement agencies, and international organizations. But before we could implement our plan, the system struck back. David Torres disappeared during a routine patrol at Yosemite, along with 2 other rangers who had been part of our investigation. Their disappearances were explained as accidents, but we knew they had been neutralized because they had become too dangerous to the arrangement. Within a week, half of our network had been compromised. Rangers were transferred, discredited, or eliminated with the efficiency of an organization that had extensive experience in managing threats to their operations. I realized that our communications had been monitored and our activities had been tracked from the beginning. Thornfield called me into her office after the wave of neutralizations began. "You need to make a choice. Stop the investigation and accept transfer to a desk job in Washington, or continue and face the same fate as your colleagues. The system is bigger than you realize, and it has resources you can't match." But she also slipped me a piece of paper with an address and a phone number. "If you choose to continue, there are people outside the Park Service who might be able to help. But contacting them will be the point of no return. Once you reach out to them, you'll be completely outside the system and there won't be any protection." The address was for a research facility in Nevada that specialized in unexplained phenomena. The phone number belonged to Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a physicist who had been studying dimensional anomalies for the past 15 years. According to the information Thornfield had given me, Dr. Warren had been investigating the same entities I had encountered, but from a scientific rather than law enforcement perspective. I made the decision to contact Dr. Warren, knowing that it would end any possibility of working within the system to expose the truth. But I also knew that the system was too well established and too well protected to be challenged from within. The conversation with Dr. Warren lasted 3 hours and changed my understanding of everything I had experienced. The entities weren't native to Earth. They were visitors from another dimension who had been establishing colonies in wilderness areas for centuries. The underground networks weren't just hiding places, they were dimensional gateways that allowed the entities to travel between their world and ours. What you've discovered is part of a much larger phenomenon, Dr. Warren explained. These entities exist in a parallel dimension that overlaps with our own in certain locations. Wilderness areas with specific geological characteristics create weak points between dimensions, allowing the entities to establish permanent settlements in our world. The harvesting of humans served multiple purposes. The entities needed genetic material to adapt to Earth's environment. They required human subjects to understand our civilization, and they used human collaborators to manage the complex logistics of maintaining their hidden colonies. But they're not the only ones, Dr. Warren continued. There are at least 17 different species from various dimensions that have established colonies on Earth. The ones you encountered are just the most organized and the most successful at integrating with human institutions. Dr. Warren's research facility was part of an international network of scientists and investigators who were studying dimensional anomalies and their effects on human civilization. They had evidence that dimensional visitors had been influencing human development for thousands of years, but their research was systematically suppressed by the same government agencies that were collaborating with the entities. "We're fighting a war that most people don't even know exists," she said. "A war for the future of human civilization against forces that have been planning our replacement for centuries. The Park Service arrangement is just one front in a much larger conflict." She offered me the opportunity to join their research network to help expose the truth about dimensional visitors and their influence on Earth. But she also warned me that the work would be dangerous, that the entities had resources and capabilities that exceeded anything I had encountered at Wolf Lake. "If you join us, you'll be hunted by the same system that eliminated your colleagues," she said. "But you'll also have access to resources and allies that can help protect you. The choice is yours." I accepted her offer, officially resigning from the Park Service and disappearing into the underground network of researchers and investigators who were fighting to expose the truth. But I also knew that my work at Wolf Lake had been just the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous investigation. The entities were still harvesting humans from wilderness areas across the country. The underground network was still expanding, reaching into new areas and establishing new colonies. And the government agencies that were supposed to protect the public were actively facilitating these activities in exchange for resources and technology. The war for the future of human civilization was being fought in the shadows, and most people didn't even know it existed. Dr. Warren's research facility in Nevada was unlike anything I had imagined. Built into a mountain complex that had once housed a military installation, it contained laboratories, libraries, and living quarters for over 200 researchers from around the world. The facility was completely self-sufficient, with its own power generation, water supply, and food production systems. But what made the facility truly extraordinary was its purpose. It was designed as a fortress against dimensional invasion. Every surface was covered with symbols and materials that prevented dimensional entities from entering or establishing gateways. The entire complex existed in a state of dimensional stability that made it invisible to the monitoring systems used by the entities and their human collaborators. "We've been preparing for this fight for over 40 years, Dr. Warren explained as she gave me a tour of the facility. "Ever since we realized that the unexplained phenomena in wilderness areas weren't random incidents, they were part of a systematic colonization effort by beings from other dimensions. The facility's main laboratory contained equipment that could detect dimensional anomalies, monitor entity activity, and track the expansion of underground networks. Banks of computers processed data from monitoring stations positioned near dimensional weak points around the world, creating a real-time map of entity activity. What the map revealed was terrifying. The entities I had encountered at Wolf Lake were part of a network that included over 300 active colonies in wilderness areas across 6 continents. The underground tunnel systems connected these colonies, allowing entities to travel thousands of miles without appearing on the surface. The colonization has been accelerating over the past decade, Dr. Warren explained. They're preparing for something big, a coordinated operation that will establish permanent dimensional gateways in major population centers. Once those gateways are opened, they'll be able to bring through unlimited numbers of entities from their dimension. The research facility had been tracking the preparation for this operation, which they called the opening. Based on their analysis, the opening would occur within the next 2 years, timed to coincide with specific astronomical events that would weaken the barriers between dimensions. The entities need human cooperation to establish gateways in populated areas, Dr. Warren continued. They've been infiltrating government agencies, corporations, and other institutions for decades, placing their collaborators in positions where they can facilitate the opening. The Park Service arrangement was just one part of this larger infiltration effort. Similar arrangements existed within the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and other agencies that controlled access to wilderness areas. But the entities had also established relationships with mining companies, construction corporations, and urban development firms that gave them access to population centers. They're planning to open dimensional gateways in 12 major cities simultaneously, Dr. Warren said, showing me a map marked with red circles. New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Denver, Seattle, Boston, Miami, Atlanta, Phoenix, Philadelphia, and San Francisco. Once those gateways are established, they'll be able to flood the surface world with entities from their dimension. The human collaborators involved in the opening included high-ranking officials in federal agencies, corporate executives, and political leaders who had been recruited through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and ideological conversion. Many of them genuinely believed that cooperation with the entities would benefit humanity, providing access to advanced technology and resources that would solve major global problems. The entities are sophisticated in their recruitment methods, Dr. Warren explained. They identify people who are dissatisfied with human limitations, who want to be part of something greater than themselves. They offer these people enhanced capabilities, extended lifespans, and access to knowledge that exceeds human understanding. The enhanced capabilities were real. The research facility had documented cases of human collaborators who exhibited physical and mental abilities that exceeded normal human limits. Enhanced strength, accelerated healing, expanded sensory perception, and cognitive abilities that approached what the entities possessed naturally. The enhancement process involves genetic modification that gradually transforms human collaborators into hybrid beings, Dr. Warren said. It's irreversible, and it creates a permanent bond between the collaborator and the entity collective. Once someone is enhanced, they can never return to purely human existence. But the facility's research had also revealed weaknesses in the entity network. The dimensional gateways required specific geological conditions to remain stable, and they could be disrupted by targeted electromagnetic interference. The entities themselves were vulnerable to certain frequencies of sound and light that could disorient them or force them to retreat to their dimension. We've developed weapons and defensive systems that can fight the entities effectively, Dr. Warren said, showing me through the facility's armory. But we're vastly outnumbered, and we're fighting an enemy that has been preparing for this conflict for centuries. The armory contained devices that looked like science fiction props, but were actually functional weapons designed to combat dimensional entities. Sonic disruptors that could create sound frequencies that were painful to entities, electromagnetic pulse generators that could collapse dimensional gateways, and protective suits that shielded the wearer from entity influence. The key to stopping the opening is disrupting their human collaboration network, Dr. Warren explained. Without human assistance, the entities can't establish gateways in populated areas. If we can expose their collaborators and break up the arrangements, we can prevent the massive dimensional invasion they're planning. The research facility was part of an international coalition called the Dimensional Defense Network, which included similar facilities in 12 countries. The DDN had been working for decades to monitor entity activity, develop countermeasures, and prepare for the eventual confrontation that would determine the future of human civilization. But we need people with inside knowledge of the collaboration network, Dr. Warren said. People like you, who have seen how the system works and understand how the entities operate. Your experience at Wolf Lake gives you insights that could be crucial to stopping the opening. Over the following months, I worked with DDN researchers to analyze the data I had collected about entity activities at Wolf Lake. My recordings, photographs, and documentation of the underground network provided crucial intelligence about entity capabilities and operational methods. But we also used my experience to plan infiltration operations aimed at gathering intelligence about the opening. The DDN had developed technology that could disguise our agents as enhanced humans, allowing them to infiltrate the collaboration network and gather information about the planned dimensional gateways. I participated in 3 of these operations, using my knowledge of Park Service procedures and entity behavior to access restricted areas and document the preparation for the opening. What we discovered was that the timeline had been accelerated. The opening was now planned for less than 6 months away. They're responding to increased awareness of their activities, Dr. Warren explained after reviewing our intelligence reports. The Columbus Day incident at Wolf Lake, the media coverage, the federal investigation, it's all made them realize that their secrecy is compromised. They're moving to implement the opening before more people learn the truth. The acceleration of their timeline created both opportunities and dangers for the DDN. The entities were more vulnerable because they were rushing their preparations, but they were also more aggressive in eliminating threats to their operations. DDN facilities around the world reported increased attacks by enhanced humans and direct incursions by entities themselves. They know we exist now, Dr. Warren said grimly. They're trying to eliminate our capability to interfere with the opening. We're in the final phase of the conflict, and we may not have enough time to prevent their plan. But our infiltration operations had also revealed the locations where the dimensional gateways would be established. In each of the 12 target cities, the entities had identified specific sites with the geological characteristics necessary to support stable gateways. Construction projects were already underway at these sites, disguised as normal urban development, but actually designed to create the infrastructure needed for dimensional portals. If we can sabotage enough of these sites, we can prevent the opening from occurring on schedule, Dr. Warren explained. But it will require coordinated strikes against heavily defended targets in major cities. We'll be fighting enhanced humans, entity security forces, and probably government agencies that are protecting the construction projects. The DDN began planning Operation Gatekeeper, a coordinated assault on the 12 gateway sites that would occur simultaneously across the United States. Each strike team would consist of DDN operatives equipped with anti-entity weapons and supported by local resistance cells that had been established in each target city. The operation will either save human civilization or get us all killed, Dr. Warren said as we reviewed the final plans. But if we don't try, the opening will succeed and humanity will become a subject species in a world controlled by dimensional entities. My role in Operation Gatekeeper was to lead the strike team targeting the Denver Gateway site, using my knowledge of entity tactics and collaboration networks to neutralize the defenses and destroy the portal infrastructure. The Denver site was particularly important because it was the most advanced of the 12 projects, and its successful completion would provide a backup option if the other gateways were compromised. You understand the entities better than anyone else on our team, Dr. Warren said. Your experience at Wolf Lake, your knowledge of how they think and operate, it gives you the best chance of succeeding at the Denver site. But as we prepared for Operation Gatekeeper, I received information that changed everything we thought we knew about the opening. One of our infiltration agents had discovered that the 12 gateway sites weren't the entity's primary plan. They were a diversion designed to draw attention away from their real objective. The opening wasn't going to occur in major cities. It was going to happen at Wolf Lake. The discovery that Wolf Lake was the real target of the opening forced us to completely revise our understanding of the entity's strategy. The 12 gateway sites in major cities weren't meant to be the primary dimensional portals. They were diversions designed to draw the DDN's resources away from the actual operation. They've been playing us from the beginning, Dr. Warren said as we analyzed the new intelligence. The urban gateway sites are real, but they're secondary objectives. The main dimensional portal is being constructed in the underground network beneath Wolf Lake, in the same chamber where you encountered the entities during your investigation. The chamber I had discovered was actually a natural dimensional weak point, one of the most stable gateways between dimensions that existed anywhere on Earth. The entities had been using Wolf Lake as their primary colony site for over a century, gradually expanding the underground network to accommodate the massive portal that would allow unlimited numbers of entities to enter our dimension. The portal they're building at Wolf Lake is 10 times larger than anything they've attempted before, Dr. Warren explained, showing me satellite imagery that revealed the true scope of the construction. It's designed to remain permanently open, creating a bridge between dimensions that can't be closed once it's activated. The satellite images showed that the underground network beneath Wolf Lake had expanded dramatically since the park was closed to the public. New tunnel systems extended for hundreds of miles in all directions, connecting to underground facilities in neighboring states. The construction projects we had thought were gateway sites in major cities were actually support facilities for the Wolf Lake portal. Once the Wolf Lake portal is opened, they won't need the urban gateways, Dr. Warren continued. They'll be able to move unlimited numbers of entities through the main portal and deploy them to any location on Earth through the underground tunnel network. The timeline for the opening had been moved up again. Intelligence suggested that the Wolf Lake portal would be activated within 3 weeks during a rare astronomical alignment that occurred only once every 847 years. The alignment would create optimal conditions for dimensional travel, allowing the entities to maintain a stable portal indefinitely. This is our last chance to prevent a complete dimensional invasion, Dr. Warren said. If the Wolf Lake portal is activated successfully, human civilization as we know it will end. We'll become a subject species in a world controlled by entities from another dimension. Operation Gatekeeper was redesigned as a focused assault on Wolf Lake, with all of the DDN's resources concentrated on a single objective: destroying the portal before it could be activated. The operation would require infiltrating the underground network, fighting through entity defenses, and sabotaging the portal construction in the 3 weeks before the astronomical alignment. The underground network at Wolf Lake contains over 10,000 entities and an unknown number of enhanced humans, Dr. Warren explained as we planned the operation. We'll be attacking a fortress that's been under construction for decades, defended by forces that have been preparing for this exact scenario. But we also had advantages that the entities didn't expect. My knowledge of the underground layout, combined with intelligence gathered from other DDN operations, had provided detailed maps of the network structure. We knew the locations of key facilities, the positions of defensive systems, and the routes that led to the central portal chamber. More importantly, we have Dr. Simmons' geological surveys, Dr. Warren said. Her radar mapping of the underground chambers revealed structural weaknesses that we can exploit. If we can collapse key support points, we can bring down large sections of the network and prevent the entities from activating the portal. Dr. Margaret Simmons, the geology professor who had first discovered the underground network, had joined the DDN after her research was suppressed by the Park Service. She had spent the past 2 years developing a plan to collapse the Wolf Lake network using targeted explosions at specific geological stress points. The network is built into natural rock formations, but it's been artificially expanded beyond what the geology can support, Dr. Simmons explained. If we detonate charges at 17 specific locations, we can trigger a cascade failure that will collapse the entire underground system. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, but executing it would require infiltrating the network, placing charges at heavily defended locations, and escaping before the collapse occurred. The operation would need to be completed in less than 6 hours, during a narrow window when entity defenses were focused on portal activation procedures. The DDN assembled a strike force of 127 operatives for the Wolf Lake operation, the largest military action in the organization's history. The team included specialists in combat, demolitions, electronics, and dimensional physics, all equipped with the most advanced anti-entity weapons the DDN had developed. This is an all-or-nothing operation, Dr. Warren addressed the assembled team. If we succeed, we save human civilization. If we fail, everyone on Earth becomes subject to entities from another dimension. There's no middle ground, no partial victory. We either win completely or we lose everything. I was assigned to lead the primary infiltration team, responsible for reaching the central portal chamber and sabotaging the activation systems. My team included 12 of the DDN's most experienced operatives, each one trained in anti-entity combat and equipped with specialized weapons designed to function in dimensional anomaly zones. The infiltration began at 3 a.m. on November 15, 2024, exactly 3 days before the astronomical alignment that would enable the opening. We entered the underground network through the same access point I had used during my original investigation, now expanded into a major entrance that led directly to the tunnel system. But the network had changed dramatically since my previous visit. The tunnels were now filled with entity activity as thousands of beings moved equipment and personnel in preparation for the portal activation. The passages were illuminated by the same pale light I had observed before, but now it was bright enough to eliminate the need for artificial lighting. We moved through the network using routes that Dr. Simmons had identified as structurally important but tactically secondary. The entities had concentrated their defenses around the main tunnels and the portal chamber, leaving the support passages relatively unguarded. As we made our way toward the first demolition target, I began to understand the true scale of what the entities had built. The underground network wasn't just a collection of chambers and tunnels. It was a complete underground city with manufacturing facilities, living quarters, research laboratories, and command centers. "They've been preparing for this for decades," whispered Jensen, one of my team members, as we observed a massive manufacturing facility through a ventilation grate. "This isn't just an invasion, it's a complete civilization ready to replace our own." The manufacturing facility was producing equipment that I recognized from my experiences at Wolf Lake. The devices used to control human behavior, the systems used to harvest people from the surface, the weapons used by enhanced humans. But they were also producing things I had never seen before. Technology that seemed designed for managing large populations of humans. We reached the first demolition target at 4:30 a.m., a critical support junction that connected 3 major tunnel systems. The charges Dr. Simmons had designed were small but powerful, shaped to direct the explosive force in ways that would maximize structural damage while minimizing the risk of premature collapse. Jensen and his demolitions team placed the charges while the rest of us maintained security. The process took 20 minutes, during which we could hear entity activity in the nearby tunnels. The sounds were different from what I had heard during my previous visits, more organized, more purposeful, as if the entities were following a specific schedule. As we moved toward the second target, we encountered our first direct resistance. A patrol of enhanced humans discovered our presence and attempted to raise an alarm. The anti-entity weapons performed exactly as designed, using sonic disruptors to disorient the enhanced humans, while electromagnetic pulse devices prevented them from communicating with their handlers. But the encounter confirmed that our presence had been detected. As we moved through the network, we began to see evidence of increased security measures, additional patrols, sealed access points, and monitoring devices that hadn't been present during my previous reconnaissance. "They know we're here," reported Martinez, our communications specialist. "Entity communications are increasing throughout the network. They're implementing security protocols and moving personnel to defensive positions." We reached the second demolition target despite the increased security, but the placement of charges took longer due to the presence of entity guards. 2 of our team members were injured during the firefight that ensued, requiring medical attention that delayed our schedule. As we moved toward the third target, the network's defensive systems activated. Energy barriers appeared across major passages, automated defense systems began firing on any human signatures they detected, and the tunnel lighting changed to a red spectrum that was painful to human eyes, but apparently didn't affect entity vision. "The network is going into lockdown mode," observed Dr. Chen, our dimensional physics specialist. "They're treating this as a direct assault on their primary facility." The lockdown made movement through the network much more difficult, but it also confirmed that we were disrupting their preparation for the opening. The entities were diverting resources from portal activation to deal with our infiltration, potentially creating vulnerabilities that we could exploit. We reached the portal chamber at 7:15 a.m., 90 minutes behind schedule, but still within the operational window for sabotaging the activation systems. The chamber had been expanded since my previous visit, now containing a dimensional portal that was unlike anything I could have imagined. The portal structure was enormous, easily 50 feet in diameter, constructed from materials that seemed to shift and change when observed directly. It was surrounded by control systems that combined entity technology with human engineering, operated by teams of enhanced humans working under the supervision of entities. The portal is already partially activated, Dr. Chen reported after scanning the structure with his dimensional monitoring equipment. They're maintaining a low-level connection between dimensions, gradually increasing the stability until the astronomical alignment allows for full activation. Through the partial portal, I could see into the entity's dimension, a realm that was similar to Earth, but fundamentally different. The landscape was covered with structures that defied geometric description, inhabited by beings that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. "We need to place the charges and get out of here," Jensen said urgently. "The portal is drawing energy from the dimensional connection, and that energy is going to interfere with our equipment if we stay too long." But as we prepared to complete our mission, something unexpected happened. The portal's energy output suddenly increased, and I could see movement in the entity's dimension, massive shapes that were approaching the dimensional barrier from the other side. "They're accelerating the activation," Dr. Chen said, his monitoring equipment showing energy levels that were far beyond what we had expected. "The portal is going to open fully within minutes, not days." The astronomical alignment that was supposed to enable the opening was still 3 days away, but the entities had found a way to compensate for the suboptimal conditions. They were using the energy from our intrusion, the disruption we had caused to their network, as a catalyst to force the portal open ahead of schedule. "We have to destroy the portal now," I said, realizing that our carefully planned demolition sequence was no longer viable. "If that portal opens fully, nothing else matters." Jensen began arming the charges we had brought for the portal chamber, while the rest of the team established a defensive perimeter. But the enhanced humans operating the portal systems had realized what we were doing, and they began coordinating with entity security forces to stop us. The final battle for the future of human civilization lasted 17 minutes. Our anti-entity weapons gave us an initial advantage, but the entities had numbers and familiarity with the terrain. As the portal continued to expand, more entities began emerging from their dimension, joining the fight against our small team. Jensen completed the charge placement with seconds to spare, but the portal was now fully active and beginning to stabilize. Through the dimensional gateway, I could see vast numbers of entities preparing to cross into our world, an invasion force that had been waiting decades for this moment. "The charges are armed," Jensen reported. 60 seconds to detonation." We began our retreat from the portal chamber, but the entities had sealed the exits. We were trapped in the chamber with an active dimensional portal and explosive charges that would detonate in less than a minute. That's when Dr. Simmons's geological plan proved its worth. The charges we had placed at structural weak points throughout the network began detonating in sequence, triggered by automated systems that didn't require human activation. The entire underground city began to collapse around us, including the chamber containing the dimensional portal. The portal structure couldn't withstand the geological collapse. As tons of rock fell into the chamber, the dimensional gateway became unstable and began to collapse in on itself. The entities that had been crossing into our dimension were pulled back into their realm, and the connection between dimensions was severed. But the collapse also trapped us in the chamber, buried under hundreds of feet of rock and debris. As the dust settled and the sounds of destruction faded, I realized that we had succeeded in preventing the opening, but at the cost of our own lives. Or so I thought. 3 days later, I woke up in a DDN medical facility, suffering from injuries that should have been fatal. Dr. Warren explained that the collapse of the Wolf Lake network had created a massive sinkhole that was visible from satellite imagery, but that DDN rescue teams had managed to extract survivors from the rubble. "The portal is gone," she said with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The dimensional connection has been severed, and the entity's invasion has been prevented. The underground network at Wolf Lake is completely destroyed, and similar networks around the world are being abandoned as the entities retreat to their dimension. The DDN had used the Wolf Lake operation as a catalyst for similar strikes against entity facilities worldwide. With the main portal destroyed and their primary invasion plan defeated, the entities had lost the capability to mount a coordinated assault on human civilization. But the victory came at a terrible cost. 43 DDN operatives had died in the Wolf Lake operation, and similar casualties had occurred at other sites around the world. The entities had also executed their human collaborators, eliminating evidence of the arrangements that had been in place for decades. The immediate threat is over, Dr. Warren said, but the entities are still out there in their dimension and in the remaining underground colonies. They'll try again eventually when they've had time to develop new strategies and rebuild their capabilities. She handed me a file containing reports from DDN facilities around the world. That's why we need people like you to continue the work. People who understand what we're fighting against and why it matters. 6 months have passed since the Wolf Lake operation, and I'm still recovering from the injuries I sustained during the collapse. But I'm also still working with the DDN, helping to monitor entity activity and prepare for future threats. The entities are gone from Wolf Lake, but the scars of their presence remain. The park is still closed to the public, officially due to geological instability caused by underground caves. The true story of what happened there is known only to a small number of people who are committed to ensuring that it never happens again. I still have nightmares about the things I saw in the underground network, about the families who disappeared and the people who were transformed by entity influence. But I also have hope that humanity can learn from this experience and be better prepared for the next threat. Because there will be a next threat. The entities who tried to invade our world were just one species from one dimension. There are others out there, in realms that exist parallel to our own, and some of them may be even more dangerous than the beings we defeated at Wolf Lake. The war for the future of human civilization isn't over. It's just entered a new phase, one that will require constant vigilance and preparation. The DDN continues its work, monitoring dimensional anomalies and developing new defenses against threats that most people can't imagine. And somewhere in the wilderness areas of America, in places where the barriers between dimensions are thin, new colonies may already be establishing themselves. New arrangements may be forming between entities and human collaborators who believe that cooperation with alien intelligence is preferable to independence. The truth about Wolf Lake has been buried again, hidden beneath layers of official secrecy and public denial. But the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, usually when it's too late to prevent disaster. That's why I'm sharing this account, despite the risks involved. People need to know what happened at Wolf Lake, what's happening in wilderness areas across the country, and what might happen in the future if we're not prepared. The entities are watching, waiting for their next opportunity. The only question is whether we'll be ready for them when they come.
The beam of my flashlight sliced through the inky darkness as I trudged through the dense Oregon forest. Towering Douglas firs creaked and swayed overhead in the autumn breeze. Fallen leaves crunched under my boots with each step. "You really think we'll find the missing hikers out here?" asked Mike, my fellow ranger, as he walked beside me. His face looked pale and tense in the moonlight filtering through the canopy. "We have to try," I replied, my breath clouding in the chilly night air. "It's been over 48 hours. If they're still alive, they won't survive another night in this cold." Mike and I had been tasked with searching a remote section of the national forest, miles from the nearest road or trailhead. 2 college students, a young man and woman, had failed to return from a weekend backpacking trip. Their families were frantic. Search parties had fanned out through the wilderness in a desperate attempt to find them. Now, as midnight approached, a sense of dread knotted my stomach. I'd been a ranger for over a decade, patrolling forests from the Great Lakes to the Appalachians. I knew the dangers that lurked in the backcountry: hungry bears, treacherous terrain, brutal weather. But out here, something felt different. Sinister. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as we pushed deeper into the woods. Suddenly, Mike froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I paused, straining my ears. In the distance, from the direction of a tangle of underbrush, came a muffled whimpering sound. Cautiously, I stepped forward, sweeping my light over the ground. My heart nearly stopped. Huddled at the base of a tree was the missing girl. Her clothes were shredded and bloody. Tears streaked her dirt-caked face. She looked up at us with wild, terrified eyes. "Run!" she screamed. "It's coming!" "Whoa, easy there. You're safe now," I said in my most soothing voice, slowly approaching the traumatized young woman. "I'm Ranger Ethan. This is Ranger Mike. We're here to help." She shrank back against the tree trunk, quaking with fear. I knelt down a few feet away, not wanting to startle her further. "Can you tell me your name?" I asked gently. "Lila," she stammered through chattering teeth. "Please, we have to go. It took Adam." A chill rippled down my spine. I exchanged a worried glance with Mike. "What took Adam?" he asked. "A bear? Mountain lion?" Lila shook her head vehemently, a hysterical edge creeping into her voice. "Not an animal. It looked like a man, but it wasn't. It moved wrong, like it was wearing someone else's skin." My blood ran cold. I'd heard local tribal legends about dark creatures stalking these woods, spirits that could take the form of animals or men, but I'd always dismissed them as campfire ghost stories. Now, seeing the primal horror in Lila's eyes, I wasn't so sure. I slipped off my pack and pulled out an emergency blanket. Moving slowly, I draped it over the shivering girl's shoulders. She clutched it around herself. "Let's get you out of here," I said, helping her to her feet. "We'll take you back to the ranger station, get you warmed up and checked out by the EMTs." As we started hiking back the way we'd come, a twig snapped in the underbrush behind us. I spun around, my light slicing through the shadows. I caught a flash of luminous eyes and a dark, gangly silhouette shambling between the trees. Then it was gone. Lila let out a choked sob. "It's following us." Icy tendrils of fear crept up the back of my neck. I drew my sidearm, flicking off the safety. "Mike, get her out of here. Call for backup. I'll cover you." He nodded grimly and pulled Lila away at a jog. I centered myself, breathing deeply like I'd been trained, and scanned the forest. A guttural growl rumbled from the brush to my left. I tried to track the sound, but it seemed to slide and fracture, echoing from multiple directions at once, as if the thing was everywhere and nowhere. Two glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, far too high off the ground to be human. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared down the creature in the darkness. The eyes blinked out of existence for a split second, then reappeared 10 yards to the right. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cold. How could it move so fast? I thumbed my radio handset clipped to my shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Ethan, badge 3274. I have a visual on an unknown hostile subject, requesting immediate backup at my location, over." A hiss of static was the only reply. I tried again, my voice cracking with tension. "Dispatch, do you copy? Over." Nothing. A sinking feeling hit my gut as I realized the truth. We were on our own out here. I steadied my aim at the space between those hellish, glowing eyes. The creature let out a raspy snarl that sounded almost mocking. Stealing my nerve, I squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the night like thunder. In the muzzle flash, I caught a glimpse of the thing. Gaunt, elongated limbs, a hairless, leathery hide, a twisted face that was a grotesque patchwork of human and animal features. Then it vanished into the shadows, my bullet shattering bark from a tree trunk behind where it had stood. Breath ragged, I waited for the thing to come charging out of the brush. But the only sound was the fading echo of my gunshot. A minute dragged by, then another. The forest was deathly silent. No owls hooting, no insects buzzing, as if everything living had fled, or been driven out. Satisfied the immediate threat had passed, I turned and sprinted to catch up with Mike and Lila. I found them half a mile ahead on the trail, pale and shaken, but unharmed. What was that thing?" Mike asked, his voice hoarse. I shook my head. "I don't know, but I'm starting to believe those old legends." I glanced at Lila, who clung to Mike's arm, wide-eyed and trembling. My heart ached for what she'd been through, and for the likely fate of her companion. "Let's keep moving," I said. "Backup should meet us at the trailhead." As we hiked, my neck prickled with the unshakable feeling of being watched from the shadows. I remembered the chilling warning I'd once heard from a Chinook elder on a ride-along in Washington. "Beware those who walk like men but hunt like beasts. They are the skinwalkers, ancient and evil, and they hunger for human souls." At the time, I'd laughed it off. Now, I shuddered at the memory. What if the old man was right? What if after years of close calls with nature's teeth and claws, I'd finally met something beyond the natural? I tightened my grip on my sidearm and quickened my pace, desperate to escape the darkness pressing in from all sides. Little did I know that the true nightmare was just beginning. We emerged from the tree line into the gravel parking lot of the remote trailhead. I blinked, momentarily disoriented by the glow of the solitary streetlight after so long and near total darkness. The lot was deserted except for our Green Forest Service SUV and the missing hiker's abandoned sedan. No backup in sight. An icy river of fear flowed through my veins. Why hadn't dispatch responded? "Get her in the truck," I ordered Mike, trying to keep my building panic out of my voice. He bundled Lila into the back seat as I slid behind the wheel. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed and sputtered but refused to catch. "No, no, no," I muttered, frantically pumping the gas. On the third try, the motor finally roared to life. I threw it in gear and slammed the accelerator. The tires spat gravel as we fishtailed out of the lot. I pushed the SUV to its limits, taking the winding forest road as fast as I dared. The high beams illuminated trees whipping by on either side. Mike braced himself against the dash. In the rearview mirror, I could see Lila hugging her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth. As we sped down an isolated stretch with steep embankments hemming us in, Lila suddenly let out a piercing scream. "It's out there! I saw it!" My eyes flicked to the side mirror. In the darkness beyond the roadside, a pair of iridescent orbs flashed in the underbrush. They were keeping pace with us. "How is that possible?" Mike croaked out. I had no answer. I just focused on driving, knuckles white on the steering wheel. An otherworldly shriek ripped through the night, Dopplering as it fell behind us. Lila sobbed in the back seat. 10 miles to the ranger station. 10 miles to safety. Nothing to do but outrun the nightmare snapping at our heels. Halfway there, the SUV lurched violently as a tire blew out. I fought for control as we swerved and skidded. We careened off the road, crashing through a guardrail. I had a snapshot vision of treetops in a steep ravine. Then everything went black as we tumbled into freefall. I clawed my way back to consciousness, pain shooting through my battered limbs. The truck was crumpled at the bottom of a gully, wedged against a fallen log. Shattered glass and twisted metal surrounded me. Disoriented, I called out for Mike and Lila. No response. I kicked out the spider-webbed windshield and crawled from the wreckage. In the feeble glow of the dying headlights, I spotted Mike slumped motionless a dozen yards away, thrown from the vehicle. A sticky pool of crimson spread beneath his head. I stumbled to him, rolling him onto his back, searching desperately for a pulse, for breath, for any sign of life. But it was too late. His vacant eyes stared into the void, glassy and still. Unfathomable grief mingled with primal terror as reality sunk in. Mike was dead. Lila was missing, likely dragged off. And somewhere out in the lightless woods, an ancient evil hunted me. I was alone with the skinwalker. Crushed under the weight of loss and dread, I slumped against the fallen log, cradling my fractured forearm against my chest. Blood dripped into my eyes from a laceration above my brow. I wiped it on the sleeve of my tattered uniform as a pained sob escaped my lips. "Mike, I'm so sorry." My radio crackled with static from where it lay a few feet away, jarred loose in the crash. I crawled to it, grimacing at the white-hot bolts of agony shooting through my ribs. I keyed the handset, a desperate surge of hope sparking in my chest. "This is Ranger Ethan. Emergency. Officer down. Need immediate assistance." The only reply was an eerie, garbled hiss, like a serpent's rattle filtered through a distorted speaker. My hope shriveled and died, replaced by dawning horror. The skinwalker. It was blocking my radio somehow. I was completely cut off. Overhead, the moon emerged from behind a veil of clouds. In its spectral light, I saw a sight that froze the blood in my veins. A trail of bloody footprints led away from the wreckage, intermingled with strange, elongated handprints pressed into the earth, as if something had crawled away on all fours like a beast. The tracks led deeper into the darkened forest. Every instinct screamed at me not to follow, to wait for rescue. But I knew in my heart that no help was coming. Not in time to save Lila from whatever nightmare awaited her. I had to act, broken body be damned. I limped to Mike's corpse, tears blurring my vision as I gently pried his sidearm from its holster with trembling hands. The crash had thrown my own gun somewhere into the underbrush. I checked the magazine. 4 rounds remaining. It would have to be enough. Jaw clenched against the pain, I set off into the woods, following the grisly trail. Step by agonizing step, I forced myself onward, even as every ragged breath sent daggers lancing through my chest. The forest closed in around me like an icy tomb. The putrid scent of rotting leaves mingled with the coppery tang of blood. An owl screeched in the branches above, nearly stopping my heart. After an eternity of hellish slogging, I reached a small clearing. Moonlight illuminated a shape at its center. A body lying on its back, a female form with long, dark hair spilled around its head like a halo. "Lila," I croaked, hope and horror warring within me. I stumbled forward and dropped to my knees beside her. But it wasn't Lila. It was the corpse of a young Native American woman in a fringed buckskin dress. Her skin was desiccated, clinging to bone. A gaping black void filled her chest where her heart should have been. She'd been dead a long, long time. Realization slammed into me like a freight train. The skinwalker's last victim, left as a gruesome message. I whirled, just as a dark shape descended from the branches above. Its eyes burned with an eldritch green glow. Impossibly long, sinewy limbs unfolded as it dropped, skittering towards me. Choking on terror, I raised my gun and pulled the trigger. Click! It was empty. The creature grinned with a mouthful of dripping fangs. Then it lunged. The skinwalker barreled into me with the force of a battering ram, knocking the useless gun from my hands. We tumbled in a tangle of thrashing limbs. I glimpsed a muzzle bristling with fangs and razor claws slashing the air. Searing agony ripped across my chest as its talons shredded my flesh. I screamed, beating at the abomination with my one good arm, but it was like punching a slab of gristled meat. The creature pinned me, its fetid breath scalding my face. Those glowing, intelligent eyes bored into mine with pure malevolence. As its jaws gaped, viscous strands of drool spattering my cheeks, I knew that I was staring into the face of death. I braced for the feeling of fangs tearing into my jugular, for my life to drain away in a crimson flood. But instead, the skinwalker reared back, its misshapen head cocking to one side as if listening to some distant sound. Then, to my shock, it spoke. Its voice was a sibilant rasp, ancient and cruel. "Not yet, little lost one. The hunt is not over. Run now, pray. Run!" With that, it bounded away into the forest, leaving me lying there, shaking and bleeding. It took an eternity for me to struggle to my feet, leaning heavily against a tree trunk for support. My mind reeled, unable to process the horror I'd just experienced. That thing had spoken to me, in English. What ungodly intelligence drove its actions? But one thing burned through the haze of pain and fear. It hadn't killed me when it had the chance. It wanted to toy with me, like a predator savoring the thrill of the chase before the kill. And it still had Lila. Rage ignited inside me, burning away the fog of despair. I wasn't going to let that happen. I wouldn't leave Lila to its non-existent mercy. Even if it cost me my life, I had to try to save her. It was my duty, my penance for leading my friends into this nightmare. I retrieved my fallen gun and set off into the forest once more, following the trail of broken undergrowth left by the skinwalker's passage. My injuries screamed with every step, but I gritted my teeth and pushed onward. I didn't know if I was tracking the creature or walking into an ambush, but it didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was finding Lila. I owed her that much. Hours passed in a red haze of pain and exhaustion as I stumbled through the endless expanse of shadowed trees. My blood-soaked shirt clung to my body, the fabric heavy and cold. I shook with chills, fever building behind my eyes. I knew my wounds were likely infected. But still, I pressed on. As false dawn lightened the eastern sky to a sickly gray, I caught a flash of movement through the trees ahead. I froze, breath catching in my throat. There, in a small grove, knelt Lila. She was bent over something on the ground, her back to me. "Lila," I called out, voice cracking. "It's Ethan. I'm here to help you." She turned slowly. Even at a distance, I could see that her eyes were blank, her movements jerky like a marionette with tangled strings. She rose to her feet and shambled towards me. "Lila?" I whispered, a knot of unease tightening in my gut. As she neared, I saw that her clothes were gone, replaced by a gruesome patchwork garment of stitched animal hides. Antlers protruded from her matted hair. Viscous black fluid dribbled from the corners of her mouth. "No," I breathed in horror. "What did it do to you?" She lunged at me, bony fingers hooked into claws. I stumbled back, narrowly avoiding her grasp. This wasn't Lila anymore. The skinwalker had done something to her, transformed her into something monstrous. She came at me again, gnashing teeth bared in a feral snarl. Tears streaming down my face, I raised the gun and took aim with shaking hands. "I'm sorry, Lila. I'm so sorry." I pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the woods like thunder. Lila staggered, a blossom of red spreading across her chest. She crumpled to the forest floor and lay still. I collapsed to my knees beside her, a howl of anguish tearing from my throat. I cradled her blood-spattered face in my hands as the light faded from her eyes. Then, all around me, the trees erupted with spectral green eyes and guttural growls. The skinwalkers emerged from the shadows, dozens of misshapen abominations skittering from the undergrowth. They encircled me, a closing noose of undulating, noisome bodies. I surged to my feet, rage and grief swallowing the last tattered remnants of my sanity. I charged at the horde, screaming until my throat was raw, emptying my gun into their midst. Searing pain exploded through me as they fell on me in a wave of snapping fangs and tearing claws. I felt my flesh shredding, my bones splintering. But I fought on, even as the world went dark and cold around me. My last thought as the skinwalkers dragged me down into oblivion was of the old Chinook legend, the one that foretold of the day the great evil would rise from the earth, and the warriors who would stand against it unto their last breath. I could only pray I had been one of them, even as I knew my fight was over. Darkness, drifting in a void beyond pain, beyond fear. A ghost of a man who once was. Then, distant voices filtering through the black, muffled and distorted as if underwater. Lucky to be alive. Severe lacerations, broken ribs, punctured lung. Ranger found him just in time, babbling about monsters. Light, lancing into my eyes like needles. I tried to turn my head away but couldn't move. Panic sparked through the narcotic numbness weighing me down. Where was I? Slowly, aching, I prized open my eyelids, squinting against the glare. Sterile white walls, humming fluorescent lights, the tang of antiseptic. I was in a hospital room swaddled in bandages, an IV line snaked from my arm. "Welcome back," said a voice, rough with exhaustion. I rolled my head to see a haggard, stubbled face smiling down at me. I blinked, uncomprehending. "Frank?" I croaked. My supervisor from the ranger station nodded, patting my unbandaged shoulder with a weathered hand. "You gave us quite a scare, son. Found you half dead in the middle of nowhere, covered in blood. What the hell happened out there?" I opened my mouth, then shut it. Memories came flooding back. The skinwalkers, Lila, Mike, the horror in the forest. But I couldn't force the words out. They curdled on my tongue like poison. Who would believe me? I hardly believed it myself. Maybe it was better to let them think a bear or a cougar had attacked us. Let Lila and Mike's families have closure untainted by cosmic evil. Let the official report read animal attack instead of supernatural entities beyond human comprehension. I don't remember, I mumbled, fresh tears leaking from the corners of my eyes. It's all a blur. Frank squeezed my shoulder. sympathy etched into the lines of his weathered face. "It's all right, Ethan. You've been through hell. Just rest now." I close my eyes, letting the tide of weariness pull me back into merciful darkness. In the weeks and months after, I threw myself into physical therapy, determined to recover, to regain my strength. But as my body healed, my mind fractured a bit more each day. I couldn't escape the nightmares. Flashes of glowing eyes and glistening fangs jolting me awake, screaming. Glimpses of distorted figures lurking in every shadow. The ceaseless feeling of being watched, stalked, hunted. The wilderness that had once been my sanctuary now filled me with only dread. The primal awareness that there were things out there beyond human reckoning. Hungry things in the forest that walked like men. And to chase that knowledge was to court madness. I quit the ranger service, moved to the city, took a job as night security guard. Told myself that concrete and electric light could keep the demons at bay. But in the darkest hours before dawn, I still see their eyes in every corner, hear their growls echoing up from the forgotten places below. And I know the truth. The skinwalkers are still out there, waiting, watching. No one is safe in the dark.